Peak Cinema. Just a little dance.
Ah, the story of Icarus, the boy with wax wings that flew too close to the sun and fell, a consequence of his hubris. Hello, I'm Sharp. I run this channel with my collaborator, Genus. We've always been a couple of curious fellas, and we thought, this is week 3 of the project, and that intro had nothing to do with this week's outcome. Intense foreshadowing. Last week, Genus directed, and we ended up making this really cool 2D horror short that we'd really appreciate it if you checked out. There's also a retrospective on it, just like this one. Links are in the description. It's my turn to direct now, so let me jump into a call with Genus and see what we can create. Oh my gosh. Last week was a lot. It's time to roll. 11. What is 11? Fairy tale. Let's mark it off. This is a fairy tale week. If you're not familiar with how 15 over 15 works, Genus and I meet on Sundays, and we randomly choose a prompt from a list that we'll make a short film out of. After we have the prompt, next up is the medium. I don't want to do another 3D one right off the bat.
Let me zoom in. What are the other options? 3D and 2D, 2D and 3D, 3D animation, VFX, traditional, simulation.
Simulation could be neat. I think I kind of want to do a simulation one. And this was our first mistake. Let me tell you a little something about animation production. When making an animation, there are some things that are physically hard and others that are technically hard. An example of something that's physically hard is hand-drawn 2D traditional animation. Once you know how to do it, there isn't a lot of figuring out to do. You just get it done. Go through the motions, make the shot look good, whatever. Even if it doesn't look good, at least you'll still have a shot, which isn't always the case with technically difficult things. Simulation, on the other hand, can be very physically easy. A lot of the time, you can just plop on some rigid body simulation onto something like a beer can and get perfect results. But the technical difficulty in simulation comes out really fast, especially in fluid simulation. You'll see what I mean later.
Okay. A simulated fairy tale. What are the first fairy tales I think of? I think of Red Riding Hood. Probably a bunch of like the Grimm fairy tales.
I think of like sprites, like forest sprites. So like little floaty, glowy things in the forest. We could do like a fairy tale kind of character, like young girl or something who's like walking around in the woods and gets whisked off or something and ends up disappearing by the end of it.
All our shorts are gonna have a bad ending.
Probably. We could do like, maybe she has a basket. She has a basket, and that can be like a framing device. Like maybe she loses the basket, or like at the end, the final shot is like the basket on the ground.
It falls to the ground, so you can do a simulation.
Yeah. A lot of people have difficulty coming up with interesting visual styles for short films super quickly. We managed to do it by using the oldest technique in the book, reference. Throughout this call, we gathered images that inspired us on different character designs, environments, and whatever kind of vibe we wanted to go for. I think you'll be pretty surprised by what we managed to turn it into, despite everything. Style is only as good as the story it serves, so that's the next thing to figure out.
What era are these from?
This is like the 4th century. The girl grabbing the basket, leaving her home, and maybe we have the home in the background. We do the girl sort of in the foreground, and the camera's tracking to her, and we show like the basket in hand. She's looking back at her home. Here, we could probably honestly start the story much later than we are. We could probably start it like here. Do a rack focus. I think a waterfall is probably a good idea. Like walking in the water towards the waterfall. We're gonna die trying to do this. Maybe a shot where we sort of framed by the waterfalls, cave's entrance. We have the little fairies coming out. The fairies are going around her face. Whoa, awesome. That's really cool. I think we do like a camera orbit, and then we settle. It's like 25 seconds worth of film right now. How do I want this to end? I don't know, but we figure it out. With most of a decent story under us, it's time to go into production. Later on, we decide that we kind of want to end with this big wolf moment and really lean into that Red Riding Hood aesthetic by just ripping it off. Who said stories had to be original? So we have this little girl wandering through the woods. She notices something and looks over and sees this big waterfall with a cave. She wades on over to it, goes into the cave, and she sees all these little fairy sprite glowy things flying around. She's dancing around with them, having a great time, and then boom, there's this wolf that shows up, and she's looking at this giant scary thing, and it just snaps, eats her, and we don't even see her like go away. We just see the basket fall, and that's what we go for. Let's see how it goes. Hello everybody, and welcome to Simulation Hell, where I wait for Blender to try and render this simulation for hours and hours on end, only to realize I need to make one minor tweak in order to make it look good. Most of the beginning of the week was pretty normal. Genus cranked out a character design, I turned it into something, slapped a rig on that puppy, and we're animating, baby. Despite the rough character modeling, the environments were actually going pretty okay. The look from the ground up was pretty ambitious, going for these really full and lush outdoor scenes. A little piece of wisdom: outdoor sets in CG, especially ones that you shoot from a high angle, are usually pretty difficult. There's less room to hide your mistakes. If you look back at the first shot from the week 1 film, you'll notice that a lot of the set assets aren't even textured. But it's fine, because we shoot it from a pretty low angle, and it's all in the dark, it's super well hidden. It's an outdoor shot, but it's pretty safe. For the spaceship in that film, we have a limited area that we have to fill out, and it's all smooth sci-fi, futuristic stuff. That stuff is pretty easy to crank out without a bunch of complex modeling or finding a bunch of secondary assets. You want to look for that kind of stuff when you're building out sets. Surprisingly enough, the hardest thing about Simulation Week was the simulations.
I think the worst part of Simulation Week so far is that I can work on something for hours and hours and then leave it to bake and just wait for it to function, but I don't learn that it doesn't work until I get to the play blast and I see that, whoops, the simulation doesn't work. I need to wait a few more hours until it fixes, and I don't have the time.
Time became an increasingly urgent concern as we moved throughout the week, time of which I was not spending the most effectively. I'll admit it, I made some big mistakes when directing this week. Remember that orbit shot that I glossed over earlier in the video, where the girl was dancing around with the fairies and then the wolf shows up? Yeah, I had Genus work on that for pretty much 2 days straight. In real animation time, that's nothing. You get like 2 weeks to do a shot. But in 15/15 time, that's like 30% of the whole film. Don't get me wrong, it's an important shot, and I think it turned out to be one of the best in the film, but it put a real crunch on everything else, while I was stuck alone troubleshooting simulations. So I'm trying to figure out how I'm gonna do the waterfall, and I've decided to mess around with Flip Fluids, which is a Blender add-on for doing fluid simulation. I did not know how bad the inbuilt fluid simulator inside of Blender was until I started messing around with this. This is simulating so much faster at a much better resolution, and maybe I'll actually be able to get this done. No. That waterfall gave me so much frustration and anger. I was up all night, Tuesday and Wednesday, trying to get it to work, but eventually I just had to concede. No more waterfall, it's just some cave over the water.
I think a waterfall is probably a good idea.
It's fine, it's all fine. Let's just move on. So Genus is done animating that shot. Let's see what it looks like. Oh. That can't be a good sign. So the fluid simulations weren't the only ones that we were having trouble with. It turns out it was all the simulations, except rigid body. That was fine.
Making a thing for A shots. And see how it's going.
Hair sims kept exploding, cloth sims kept clipping, and even dynamic paint didn't look right. That's supposed to be the easy one. Even with all of that, a bigger problem was dawning, one that might have stopped us from finishing the film. Before we get to that, let's go over how simulations all kind of work in Blender so you can understand just how bad this is. Simulations have dynamics, which is just the motion the thing has to do. If it's water, it's going to be all the liquid motion. If it's hair, it's going to be wiggling around or blowing in the wind. Either way, this stuff is very difficult to compute. While some real-time simulations are possible, they're usually only possible under very restricted means and simplified objects, so it's not what we tend to go for. A much better method is baking. You have Blender go over all the motion your object has to do within a specified frame range, and write it down to a file so it doesn't have to calculate it on the fly. This not only makes things easier for your computer to process, it also saves your simulation so it doesn't change on you randomly later. We
did not do this. At least we didn't do it properly. There's a little button in the cast section of simulations in Blender, and it's really important that you turn this on. This allows Blender to write your simulation to external files rather than just keeping it in your computer's memory. If you don't do this, when Blender crashes, you'll inevitably have to simulate it again. But wait, it gets worse. Simulations in Blender aren't entirely deterministic. Running the same simulation twice on the same object might give you two different results. If, let's say, Blender crashes during your render, not only do you have to rebake your simulation, you have to re-render all of the frames you've already done. Because if you don't, your animation's gonna
Peak cinema. Just a little dance.
By the time Friday came around, we'd pretty much lost hope. Our simulations were crashing, our renders were failing. Things got so bad that we had to render some of our shots in Eevee while others were rendered in cycles. Do you know how bad it is to render in two render engines? Do you know how terrible that looks? It looks like this! I wanted to say that it was impossible. Except for one thing. Our friends really came together to make this possible. They set up computers so we could get our renders done. They encouraged us along the way, and our friend Ciarenn even did the eye design for the wolf. If there's one thing to take away from this, it's that if you need help, ask for it. You'd be surprised how willing the people around you are to help. But at the end of the day, we dug ourselves a deep hole. It was physically impossible for us to render all the shots that we needed, and we ended up having to cut about half the film. Still though, I'm not mad. I'm happy, actually. I'm happy that we made this film, and I'm happy that I got to do it with all my friends. It's currently 12:01 a.m. on Sunday, and I just wanted to give my final thoughts on what happened this week. I am so disappointed, and it's fine. You know, we got the film done. I ended up cutting like 10 seconds worth of animation in the last minute, which I never, ever want to do again. But even though it really failed to meet the expectations that I wanted it to, and we didn't end up having half the things that I wanted to have in it. We didn't have the waterfall, we had to cut a bunch of the animation. A lot of the animation just does not look the way that I wanted it to. We ended up having to use 2 different rendering engines, which is such a ridiculous compromise. I still am happy that we made it. I'm still very happy that we made it because I learned a lot, and I learned that I need to plan ahead, I need to learn more about my tools, my software, and I need to be more pragmatic when I'm going into production. You know, as much as I'm disappointed that this didn't turn out being the film that I wanted it to be, I'm happy that now I know what film I don't want to make in the future. If you want to check out the film, it's here in the end card. We have a few other films and retrospectives on this channel. Thanks, and
Next time on 15 over 15.
Cycle went horribly.
Trying to make this week as easy as possible.
I'm sure that next week is just going to completely destroy us.